On today's World Insight, full steam ahead with China's optimized COVID policy, which means little or no mobility restrictions ahead of the Chinese New Year holidays. How well has China managed the pandemic? The lowdown from Jeffrey Sachs, who chairs the COVID Commission of the medical journal, The Lancet.
We're in an interconnected world where no country can solve the climate crisis on its own. No country can solve the oceans crisis on its own. No country can solve a pandemic on its own.
Here is our host, Tian.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian. This is our special program, Moving Forward. Having officially been declared as a pandemic by the World Health Organization at the start of 2020, 2023 marks the fourth year that COVID has upended societies. Since the outbreak of the pandemic, COVID has had a number of major variants, including Alpha, Beta, Delta, and Omicron. And nations have gone through different phases of opening, reopening, and returning to normalcy. Meanwhile, China recently has optimized its COVID policy. For more insights, I talked to Jeffrey Sachs, who served as chair of the COVID-19 Commission for the leading medical journal, The Lancet. We are joined by Jeffrey Sachs, chair of the COVID-19 Commission for the leading medical journal, The Lancet. Professor Sachs, good to see you once again. You have been very outspoken on the issue. What have you found out? It seems to be quite a breathtaking report you put out there.
Well, this has been a breathtaking pandemic, literally, and in the magnitude of the impact around the world. There are perhaps 18 million dead worldwide. We did not have the kind of global cooperation needed. We did not have, in most places, the kind of policies within the countries that really could have limited the deaths. In my country, the United States, by the estimates that we use, which is modeled estimates, because deaths are not only those that are reported, but those that are also estimated alongside that. There were more than 1 million deaths from the pandemic during this period, and that's a lot. We are making a number of recommendations for greatly increased diplomacy, strengthening the World Health Organization, and of course, for more effective programs and preparedness within countries. This will not be the last of these pandemics, unfortunately.
Professor, we see from the time when you put out the report back in November to now, we also have various events evolving about both the pandemic situation and also how people are dealing with it and how people are looking at one another in terms of how to deal with it. So, Professor Sachs, what is your latest takeaway given what happened, quite some drama over the past 3 months already?
Well, I think the most dramatic questions have been in China, actually, which is basically the end of the dynamic zero COVID policy. And the situation was that Omicron variants are so much more infectious that the kind of control measures that were used for the original variants really could not work. The original variants had what we call a basic reproduction number of between 2 and 3, meaning that on average in a essentially uncontrolled environment, each infected person would infect 2 or 3 others. That's enough to create a massive pandemic. But the Omicron is much higher than that. The good news is 2 points. One, by the time of Omicron in China and in much, though not all of the world, the vaccination rates were already very, very high. So this is extremely important. That's actually the key point of a zero COVID policy. Give time for vaccination coverage and improved drugs and improved treatment to be able to be put in place. And second, it looks very likely, though all evidence are disputed, that the Omicron variant is less lethal than the earlier variants like Delta or the original variant. So I think lifting the zero COVID was inevitable. All of the countries of the Asia Pacific region did so, and it's a difficult thing. The main point is to make sure that especially the extreme elderly and people with comorbidities or so-called prior conditions are protected.
How much do you see we have progress in terms of sharing vaccines and sharing vaccines at the price that the economies that are receiving it will be able to afford?
We have basically a strange and a very unsatisfactory situation with vaccines and with drugs in general, but especially with the vaccines in this case. And that is that they really are public goods in the sense that their development is for the global benefit, heavily financed by governments. For example, the National Institutes of Health in the United States spent a lot of money, rightly so, to help develop these mRNA vaccines and other vaccines and medicines. But then the results of that research are privatized. And so basically the property rights that should be owned by everybody were turned over to Pfizer and Moderna. That created a lot of billionaires, and it made the vaccine use market-based. Those companies, for example, did not share their know-how, even though it was developed heavily with government support. And when it came to providing vaccines, they negotiated good, lucrative contracts with governments rather than going through the international sharing mechanism that was called COVAX. So this was a bit of a debacle. I've seen this now for a long time. We want private companies, we want them to have incentives, but the idea that you just turn over this knowledge to private companies, especially after funding it publicly, is a wrong idea. Absolutely wrong. That's unfortunately the American system. Public spending, private profit, and it doesn't work. This technology should be shared globally. And by the way, it should also be monitored and tested scientifically in a cooperative way with good, systematic, worldwide collection of data by scientific authorities and shared across countries. None of this happened properly. So our report, I will tell you, it will not be a decisive recommendation because I've been at this for a quarter century, back with AIDS and other issues, malaria and so forth. But our recommendation is to recognize that these are public goods. And so giving the property rights solely to private producers is a serious mistake and detrimental to the world's well-being.
We have observed through the past few years as the pandemic evolves that some of the critical voices, whether it's from the scientific community, from the governance community, and from the academic community, have been silenced. And we also see misinformation at many times triumphant against the information closest to truth, closest to reality. So how do you see as one of those voices sometimes would like to be silenced by some, Professor Sachs, and also the members of the commission together with you to work on this report? How do you see this phenomenon when you are working on this report? How would you be able to balance that with the realities you're likely to face?
You know, governments want their narratives. In my country, in the United States, the government wanted this story to be told in a particular way. If you told it in a different way, it was rather difficult. At the same time, in this debate, lots of things are said, many of which are silly or completely unfounded as well. So we're dealing with an area where the knowledge is highly technical, and that means that the ability to parse the knowledge is rather difficult. It's very, very limited, and it's highly contested, and there are lots of vested interests in such a topic. Lots of reasons why governments want to keep things secret. Lots of reasons why companies want to tell the story in a particular way. Lots of confusion. People were panicked. Lots of things that government said were not credible, not believable. It's a very difficult question to answer. My role as an academic, as a scholar, is to try to be as accurate and clear as possible. By the way, in an uncertain environment, so it's possible to make absolutely legitimate, honest mistakes because the information is constantly changing as we learn more.
Yeah. How do you see, on the one hand, we need to rely on science. On the other hand, there are limits of science that we should be ever more aware of and admit as well.
This is a great point you're making. We must not politicize or weaponize science. So one of the things that happened early in the pandemic was countries pointing fingers at other countries, the United States attacking China, for example. This immediately led to this whole issue being deeply politicized or weaponized. Even today, by the way, as China has lifted the zero COVID policy, the Western press attacks Chinese policy every day. How ridiculous, how hopeless, without reporting any data that China successfully kept the deaths way below those of the United States, for example, because the narrative is weaponized. It's not trying to find the truth, it's trying to score a point. And with the science, one of the things that we saw, which is just terrible, is that since science is supported by governments and governments have political agendas, that also means that the scientific discussion itself is politicized, not initially by the scientists, but by the government agencies that actually drive this. So I've been very unhappy in the United States with how the National Institutes of Health, which is a wonderful scientific body, politicized this issue in many ways. It did not tell the story of what we knew, what we didn't know, for example, about the origins, about research that had been supported by NIH, things that we need to know about. These things were not told properly.
As you mentioned, there is a long, quote-unquote, supply chain on this. All the things related to the pandemic, the vaccines, the special treatment, and also the scientists, the politicians, and the list goes on, the businesses as well. But what would make all the stakeholders be able to walk in the right path? Do we lack of a governance system? Do we lack of a mechanism which everybody's enthusiasm to support how we human beings can successfully deal with the pandemic can be nurtured?
We did create institutions starting in 1948, the World Health Organization, and even we had early on in this pandemic an interesting institution called COVAX, which was to help poor countries get vaccines.
We also have CEPI, Gavi, WHO involved, UNICEF involved. All of these are very outstanding organizations trying to make it possible to vaccines to everyone.
Precisely. And these institutions did not work very well in this pandemic. Better that they existed than not, but they did not function well. And so we need to take lessons, and that's what the Lancet COVID-19 Commission report talks about. In my view, intrinsically in a pandemic, we have a global scale problem. Intrinsically, we need global scale cooperation. We face two fundamental institutional problems. One is that governments are not global, they're national, sometimes even local. And second, companies are global but profit-seeking, self-interested. And so these mechanisms are not suitable for a pandemic emergency. And often in our science fiction movies, we see the world comes together when we have an alien invasion of Earth, and then suddenly humanity understands, oh, we're all in this together. US, China, Russia, everybody cooperating. That's what it is in the movies. Well, a pandemic is like that too. We faced a common pathogen. We should have been cooperating actively. I repeatedly beseeched US officials, speak with your Chinese counterparts, speak with your Russian counterparts. They basically did not do it. And this is, by the way, not only in the pandemic issue, it's in other issues that you and I have spoken about in the past. We need absolutely open dialogue on an ongoing basis for transboundary or international issues. WHO is the organization created for this purpose. It's only as strong as the leading countries allow it to be. You know, in the first year of the pandemic, Trump took the United States out of WHO. It's almost worse than a comic book that in the middle of a pandemic, one of the major countries leaves WHO. This is absolutely unacceptable. And we need to take a lesson from this because there will be more crises, how to foster actual cooperation among professionals and among experts to let them do their job. They cannot be national politicians because national politicians have a national constituency. We need global citizens operating in global institutions to help get this done. And without the self-interest of power and money, it's tricky, but it's not impossible. And we have gone part way to making those solutions, but we found that they were weak compared to the national and financial interests.
Professor, as you know, years and probably decades before this pandemic, if you look at even the Hollywood movies, you've already noticed there are movies that are exactly describing what it means to face up to a pandemic, what people need to do, what might be the pitfalls in a pandemic, governance, vaccines, shares of resources, and the list goes on, and what needs exactly to be done. But even the movies we haven't watched carefully, we ignore them as if they are not the popular ones. We just ignore them compared to the other blockbusters. So I don't want to question the human nature, but I do want to ask you, Professor, are you optimistic about human race, human being, or are you pessimistic, since you have seen quite some ups and downs in your professional career?
Well, we have no room to allow pessimism to determine our actions. The whole point is the future is always in our hands. We have choices to make. And so this isn't really a game of making predictions. It's a game of figuring out what to do. And as you say, there are lots of things known about what to do. We have to draw some lessons, and that's why I was very pleased to lead this commission for 2 years, because I want to make a record to learn some lessons. And I think these lessons are quite general right now, because we face so many transboundary issues. We're in an interconnected world where no country can solve the climate crisis on its own. No country can solve the oceans crisis on its own. No country can solve a pandemic on its own. And yet we're embroiled in geopolitical tensions, which are the opposite of what we need. And since I work with friends and colleagues and former students and government officials in China, in Russia, in the United States, in Brazil, and countless countries around the world, I know there is absolutely nothing intrinsic that stops us from cooperating with each other. We're failing to do it because the mindsets remain very local, even when we are facing global crises. So it is really getting that global mindset in place, helping people to understand that we're all in this, we're all in this together. That is really the key, and that's what I'm trying to do day in, day out.
I would love to learn as to how you pick yourself up at a time when the hope is quite dim. I think we all need to learn to do it ourselves in our lives on one thing or another.
Yeah, not to interrupt you, but just to mention, when one of the lucky things for me is I travel a lot, travel around the world. I was just in Brazil in the last few days for the inauguration of President Lula. Whenever you go anywhere, you meet outstanding people who want to do the right thing. So that's how you lift yourself up, because the world has no shortage of wonderful people, and in every country, in every society. And that's the good thing. You know, we want to find solutions. So it's never impossible to find solutions to these problems.
Professor Sachs, before we go, a question I think that's in everybody's mind. We do not know how Omicron is likely to evolve. It is still a big question mark. But with that unknown, what we need to know is that we need to move forward better than we did over the past few years, to talk about many things as to how we can be better. But to you, what is the priorities as we see vaccines, special treatment are more moving from only the global north to the global south? But we also see a world facing layers of different challenges, including recessions likely to be 1/3 of the world's population. So, Professor, here is another situation about, you know, what is for now? What about now?
Yeah, the main thing absolutely we need, if I could put one point on the table, is dialogue right now. We need to get climate experts together across the countries. We need to get the energy system experts together across the countries. We need to get the public health specialists working together across countries and making practical recommendations. Our governments are generally in need of that kind of independent expertise for guidance. Governments intrinsically, my own is a government of amateurs. It's a government of the people, so people come in, they're amateur, they're not specialists at all, they don't really know what they're doing. They need independent advice. When they make it up, when the politicians say, we know what to do, then we get disasters. When it's done only within a country because it's us against the others, then it doesn't work. So on all of the issues right now, we urgently need serious discussion and practical recommendations. And it's possible to find solutions. When it comes to the pandemic itself, there will be more variants. There will be a need for new vaccine types. There is a need for surveillance and monitoring. There is a need to help the poor countries still, rather urgently, to build basic health systems. There's a need to pool financing. These are, by and large, technical issues where Chinese senior representatives, United States, European Union, Russia, African Union, Latin America need to seriously work and come up with specific, actionable recommendations.
Yeah.
One good place for this, by the way, is the G20, because it's not all 193 countries. That's a big committee. It's 20 countries with about 85% of the world income. Yes. I want to add the African Union into that. Then you have a vast majority of the world population, and we could actually get this kind of brainstorming done on a systematic basis.
Just one question I want to add. Professor, you've been spoken your mind, but what if you're wrong? What would you do when you are wrong? You know, that's a question facing everyone these days, because everybody and everyone in there, as long as they are the stakeholder, could be wrong, and they could make tremendous impact on the lives of the others.
Every day from morning till night, I'm reading, talking to experts, studying, and changing my mind when I learn something important that corrects something that I have understood or believed before. So this is operating in an uncertain environment. I have a very lucky situation myself, which is that I get to talk to a lot of people every day who are experts in their field. I get to compare views. I get to listen to opposing opinions. Right. But you need constantly to be thinking of this as updating information. And by the way, one of the things I recommend everybody is try as much as you can to listen to different views. Every day about the war in Ukraine, I listen to the Russian bloggers, I listen to the US version. They're very different. They're each propagandized in their own way often. But by listening to different views, and as much as you have an opportunity, listening to people who have experience and knowledge, you can continue to update your views to be as accurate as possible.
Right. Professor Sachs, you're always very humble in terms of expressing your opinions, but I hope many around the world, no matter which country they are in, will be having more takeaways about what they experienced and what they should learn, hopefully, together. Jeffrey Sachs.
Let's hope for the new year. Thank you.
Thank you, as always. That was my conversation with Jeffrey Sachs, the chair of the COVID-19 Commission for the leading medical journal, The Lancet. That's all the time for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us.